Narrator. In the brutal calculus of war, some roles are clear. The infantryman advances, the tanker assaults, the artilleryman pounds. But what happens when those lines are erased? When the designated place of healing becomes the front line? When the man trained to save lives must, in that terrible moment, decide whether to take them? This is not a story of a sweeping offensive or a decisive general. This is the story of one man in one shattered patch of forest on one desperate afternoon. A man who faced an impossible choice: abandon the wounded to their fate, or stand his ground against an overwhelming enemy. The title of this story asks the question that defines his legend. When a medic's aid station was overrun, how he saved 100 men alone. Pause. The setting: the Hürtgen Forest, Germany. Late November 1944. A place American GIs would soon call the Death Factory. For the men of the 22nd Infantry Regiment, 4th Infantry Division, the dream of a swift advance into Germany has died amidst a nightmarish labyrinth of dense fir trees, mud, and murderous German defenses. Narrator. To understand the gravity of that afternoon, we must first understand the man and the place. The 22nd Infantry had been fighting in the Hürtgen since early November. Their objective was to push through to the Roer River dams, but the German 275th Infantry Division, supplemented by paratroopers and battle-hardened Volksgrenadiers, had other plans. The forest itself was a weapon. Visibility was often less than 50 yards. Roads were muddy tracks, impassable for tanks. Artillery shells detonated in the thick fir canopy, raining down a deadly shower of wood splinters and shrapnel, a phenomenon known as tree burst. Casualties were not a matter of if, but when and how many. Sound of wind through pine trees, distant cracking of branches. In this hell, the medical personnel were the thin, fragile thread holding the regiment together. Among them was a combat medic named Private First Class Richard "Doc" Anderson. At 23, Anderson was not a seasoned veteran of multiple campaigns, but in the weeks in the Hürtgen, he had seen a lifetime's worth of suffering. He was assigned to the 2nd Battalion's aid station, a constantly moving collection of medical tents and foxholes established just behind the nebulous front line. The station, on November 26th, was little more than a captured German log bunker, reinforced with sandbags and a cluster of rain-soaked pup tents in a small clearing. It held over 100 men, a grim census of the battalion's recent failed assault. There were men with gut wounds, compound fractures, traumatic amputations, and severe shock. 2 exhausted battalion surgeons, Captains Miller and Gaines, worked tirelessly inside the bunker, while Anderson and a handful of other medics, orderlies, and litter bearers managed the flow of patients outside. The strategic situation was dire. The 2nd Battalion's attack had been repulsed with heavy losses. German counterattacks were expected at any moment. Communications were sporadic. The single Jeep ambulance trail back to the rear was under intermittent mortar fire. The aid station was, for all intents and purposes, stranded. And in the eerie, fog-shrouded silence of the late morning, a new sound began to filter through the pines. Not the random crump of distant artillery, but the distinctive, sharp cracks of close-range small arms fire. The front, whatever that meant here, was getting closer. By 11:30 hours, the distant firefight had become a constant, rolling thunder. Then, the first stragglers appeared. Grim-faced riflemen from Fox and George companies, falling back through the aid station perimeter. Their reports were fragmented, panicked. "They're right behind us! A whole platoon of Fritzes, maybe more! They came right through the mist!" The German forces, elements of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Regiment, known for their ferocity in close combat, were exploiting a gap in the American line. Their objective: sever the American battalion's supply and evacuation route, effectively encircling and destroying it. And the most obvious, softest target on that route was the aid station. Captain Miller, assessing the situation with cold clinical dread, made a fateful decision. He ordered all able-bodied litter bearers and orderlies to pick up rifles and form a makeshift defensive perimeter. The two surgeons would continue operating. And he turned to PFC Anderson. "Anderson," he said, his voice taut, "you're in charge of the patients outside. Get as many as you can into the bunker or undercover. Do whatever you have to do." Pause. Anderson was a medic. His creed, emblazoned on his helmet and in his training, was the Geneva Conventions. He carried a pistol, but it was for defense in the most extreme circumstances, a theoretical last resort. Now, that theory was about to be tested. He looked at the sea of wounded men around him, men who could not run, could not fight. Their eyes, wide with pain and a new, dawning fear, were fixed on him. By 12:15 hours, the first German bullets began snapping through the upper branches of the trees around the clearing. The pop, pop, pop of American M1 Garands answered. The defensive perimeter, a ragged line of about 15 cooks, clerks, and medics, now turned infantrymen, was engaged. Sound of intense close-range rifle fire, German MP-40 bursts. The German paratroopers, using classic infiltration tactics, moved from tree to tree, their grey-green smocks making them ghosts in the forest. They began to outflank the thin American line. At 12:45 hours, a German machine gun team, an MG-42, set up on a slight rise to the east of the clearing. Its terrifying, ripping sound, like tearing canvas at 1,200 rounds per minute, chattered to life. The gunner hosed the American perimeter and the aid station area indiscriminately. Tents were shredded. Dirt and snow erupted around wounded men. The buzzsaw had found them. Within minutes, the makeshift defense began to crumble. A litter bearer fell, shot through the shoulder. Then another. The line was bending, and then it broke. Survivors from the perimeter fell back into the clearing itself, firing wildly as they retreated. Pause. Anderson dragged two wounded men from their stretchers into a shallow drainage ditch. He saw a German paratrooper, wearing the distinctive rimless helmet, step into the clearing from the west, lobbing a stick grenade toward the bunker entrance. The explosion was deafening, showering the area with dirt and debris. The aid station was no longer a sanctuary. It was the battlefield. The bunker door was partially blocked. The surgeons inside were trapped, their world now the bloody operating table under the flickering lantern light. Outside, Anderson was alone with over 30 severely wounded men in the open, and another 60+ in the fragile tents and lean-tos. The Germans were now in the clearing. This was it, the overrun. For Richard Anderson, time seemed to compress and stretch simultaneously. The world narrowed to the few square yards around him. The roar of the MG-42, the screams of the wounded, the guttural shouts in German, it all fused into a deafening cacophony. He saw a German soldier, not 30 yards away, level his rifle at a wounded lieutenant trying to crawl toward cover. There was no time for thought, only instinct. Anderson drew his M19 11.45 caliber pistol from its holster, raised it with both hands, and fired. The shot echoed, strangely distinct amid the automatic weapons fire. The German soldier stumbled and fell. Sound of a single sharp pistol shot, then a brief, stunned silence in the audio mix before chaos resumes. In that moment, the medic was gone. In his place was a soldier fighting for the lives of his comrades. He scrambled from man to man in the ditch. To a young private crying for his mother, Anderson pressed a field dressing into his hands. "Hold this here. Stay down." To a sergeant with a leg shattered by a tree burst, he administered a precious syringe of morphine, his hands steady despite the bullets kicking up dirt around them. But treating wounds was no longer enough. The threat had to be neutralized. He spotted the source of the heaviest fire, the MG-42 nest. Two Germans, the gunner and his assistant, were focused on suppressing the bunker's firing slit. They had not seen Anderson in the ditch. Crawling on his belly, he moved along the depression until he was parallel to them, about 25 yards away. He had never thrown a grenade in combat. He pulled a fragmentation grenade from his belt, pulled the pin, let the spoon fly, counted 1, 2, and lobbed it in a high arc. Pause. The explosion was muffled by the soft earth of the German firing position. The machine gun fell silent. One less immediate threat, but others were flooding in.
He saw 3 paratroopers moving toward a cluster of pup tents, their bayonets fixed. Anderson fired his pistol again. One man went down. The other 2 dove for cover and began firing back at his position. Bullets whizzed overhead, thudding into the dirt bank behind him. He was pinned. He looked at his pistol. He had maybe 2 magazines left. Against a company of elite German paratroopers, it was a hopeless equation. Then, he remembered the wounded. Not just as patients, but as potential defenders. He crawled to a corporal with a shoulder wound. His shooting arm was fine. "Corporal, can you fire a rifle?" The man, pale from blood loss, nodded. Anderson scrambled out into the open, a mad dash under fire, to where a fallen perimeter guard lay. He snatched the man's M1 Garand and a bandolier of clips, and slid back into the ditch. He handed the rifle to the corporal. "Watch that tree line to the left." He repeated this act twice more, arming 2 other wounded men who could still hold and aim a weapon. He created, in essence, a last-ditch defensive pocket centered on the most critically wounded. Sound of sporadic, determined rifle fire from the American ditch, mixed with German fire. Narrator. The fighting became a brutal, intimate stalemate. The Germans, surprised by the fierce resistance emanating from what they assumed was a soft target, became more cautious. They couldn't simply overrun the position without taking casualties. Anderson moved like a phantom, darting from one end of his makeshift strongpoint to the other, firing his pistol, directing the fire of his improvised squad, and simultaneously trying to staunch bleeding and ease pain. He used bandages from fallen men, administered the last of his morphine, and spoke words of desperate encouragement. "Hold on, just hold on, someone's coming." He didn't know if that was true. For all he knew, the entire battalion had been wiped out. Inside the bunker, Captains Miller and Gaines could only listen to the hell unfolding outside. They could not open the door. They could not stop their surgery. The fate of every man in the clearing rested on the shoulders of one 23-year-old medic from Ohio, armed with a pistol, a few rifles, and a sheer, unbreakable will that refused to accept the massacre of 100 helpless men. As the afternoon wore on towards 1500 hours, Anderson's situation was becoming critical. Ammunition was running low. His ad hoc squad of wounded defenders was tiring, their initial surge of adrenaline fading into agony and exhaustion. The Germans, realizing the resistance was isolated, began to coordinate a final push. Anderson could see them gathering for an assault from the north and west. He had perhaps minutes before they overwhelmed his position with a concentrated rush. He made a decision. He would have to gamble everything on one audacious move. He turned to the corporal with the M1. "Give me covering fire. As much as you can. Aim for movement, not to hit, just make them keep their heads down." Then, ignoring the corporal's protests, Anderson did the unthinkable. He stood up. In full view of the German positions, he did not run for cover. Instead, he walked with a deliberate, almost reckless calm toward the center of the clearing, where a destroyed supply jeep smoldered. His intent was not to be a hero. It was to be a target. A distraction. Pause. He fired his pistol toward the German positions, not aiming, simply making noise. He shouted, not in English, but in the few phrases of German he'd picked up. "Kamerad, surrender. You are surrounded." It was a breathtaking bluff. He was one man, claiming an entire American company was about to counterattack. For a few, crucial seconds, the German fire slackened. They were confused. Was this man insane, or was he the advance scout for a relief force? In that momentary hesitation, fate intervened. From the south, along the jeep trail, a new sound erupted. Not the crack of rifles, but the deeper, heavier roar of a .30 caliber machine gun and the distinctive bang 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 of a tank's main gun firing canister shot, a giant shotgun blast designed for anti-personnel work. A platoon from Love Company, reinforced by a single, precious M4 Sherman tank that had miraculously navigated the forest trail, had finally fought its way through. The German paratroopers, now caught between Anderson's stubborn defense and a fresh, armored American force, had no choice. Their assault broken, they began to melt back into the forest, dragging their own wounded with them. The Sherman's machine gun hosed the tree line, and the German resistance faded as quickly as it had appeared. Anderson, his body shaking with adrenaline and spent terror, lowered his pistol. He watched as the Love Company infantrymen swept into the clearing, securing the perimeter. He didn't celebrate. He simply turned and walked back to the ditch. He knelt beside the first wounded man he saw and began checking his bandage, his hands now beginning to tremble uncontrollably. The medic had returned. The battle was over. When the final accounting was done, the cost was horrifying, yet the salvation was miraculous. Of the 105 wounded men present at the aid station when the attack began, only 3 were killed during the overrun, a tragically low number given the ferocity of the assault. 17 of the makeshift perimeter defenders and litter bearers were killed or wounded. German casualties were estimated at over 20, with the destroyed machine gun nest and Anderson's determined defense taking a significant toll. But the numbers alone don't tell the story. Every one of those 100 wounded men who survived did so because one man refused to let the sanctity of his aid post be violated. Richard Anderson had, for nearly 2 hours, acted as combat commander, triage surgeon, and frontline defender. He had blurred the lines of the Geneva Conventions not out of aggression, but out of an ultimate, profound commitment to its highest principle, the protection of the wounded and helpless. For his actions on November 26, 1944, in the Hurtgen Forest, Private First Class Richard Anderson was recommended for the nation's highest award. He was not a commander leading a charge, but a healer making a stand. The Medal of Honor was deemed for actions of active combat leadership. Instead, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor, for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. The citation detailed his armed defense, his redistribution of weapons, his fearless exposure of himself to draw fire, and his unwavering medical care under direct enemy assault. Narrator. After the war, Richard Anderson returned home. Like so many of the greatest heroes, he rarely spoke of that afternoon in the forest. He had not seen himself as a warrior, but as a medic who had simply done his duty to his patients, by any means necessary. His story, buried in the archives of the horrific Hurtgen campaign, exemplifies a different kind of courage. Not the courage of the attack, but the deeper, more resilient courage of the shield. The courage to stand firm when everything is falling apart, to protect life when the machinery of war exists solely to destroy it. The legacy of Doc Anderson is a testament to the fact that in the very heart of the death factory, humanity, armed with nothing but will and a .45 pistol, could still hold its ground. Narrator. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. A story not of grand strategy, but of individual resolve in a single, forgotten clearing.